awareness of what Stephen's death would have meant was perhaps in its infancy in terms of how much we recognize the significance of it at the time of his death. I think ultimately, for example, if I may, on the night that I learned of Stephen's murder, it was for me a significant moment in determining what my commitment to Christian life and ministry was going to be. Indeed, I was approaching ordination and quite concerned that I wasn't sure that I would be in the pulpit every Sunday leading worship. And so when that happened, it answered a number of questions that were going on for several years. I think at another level, we could not have imagined what Stephen's murder would have brought about. I think he was not the first Black person to have been killed in Britain because of his color or cultural ethnic background. And so what his murder meant was that several people who had had no interest in racial justice or the questions that would have emerged from Stephen's death actually came on board. That was quite clear. Indeed, 3-4 years later, I became the secretary to the Racial Justice Commission for CTBI. And that for me was unexpected as anything else in my life would have been, and have the privilege to work with some of the most outstanding, committed people to the question of racial justice. But I think two other things would have been not envisaged by his death. The lack of the police to find and apprehend Stephen's killers, despite the evidence that was available to them, was shocking to most of us. I think secondly, the consequence of that handling of the case, which led ultimately to the Race Relations Amendment Act, became a source of inspiration for many people. But it also became a challenge to many, because some said, quote unquote, the government has gone too far in bringing forward such a piece of legislation. And really, basically, what the government wanted to say to public authorities, including the police, that we must, absolutely must, promote racial equality and good race relations, not just to the police service, the Metropolitan Police Service, but right across the institutions of this country.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Arlington. Anyone else want to, Pat, over to you?
Yes, a different approach. Certainly I recall listening to, I think it was LBC on the night Stephen Lawrence was murdered. And for me, it wasn't about, and having driven through Eltham earlier that night, it was about a young man being killed, but it wasn't told to us from a perspective of a racist murder. It was more, was he linked to, drugs? Was he linked to gang warfare? As a youth officer at the time, I had to be listening to this information because I'm having to deliver a service or set up services for young people at the time. So for me, it wasn't evident at the time what the outcome of what we now know to be facts and the changes that has occurred following the killing. Because we were led to believe at the time it was all to do with yet another Black young man who's been involved in crime, and ultimately this was it. It wasn't about, we weren't clued up at all at the time based on what we heard on the radio that it was a racist murder. Certainly from Church's Commission for Racial Justice, of which I was in Arlington. Arlington wasn't there at the time, but certainly David Aslam, who was the secretary, and the commissioners, we knew slightly different. because of what we were having to deal with prior to Stephen Lawrence's death, which was other killings and other murders, particularly in Greenwich, Plumstead, around that area. And we recognised, because of the work that we were doing, that the BNP had set up, the National Front had set up an office certainly around Eltham at the time. And that's where all the murders were taking place. So for me, it became much clearer, based on the work of CCRJ, Churches Commission for Racial Justice, that changes would have to happen. And the amendment to Race Relations Act, for me as a local authorities officer, having to say to churches, you now need to look at an equal opportunities policy. You need to look at what you're doing within your church's youth work around equalities. So for me, the change was welcoming, in that organisations had to were made accountable for the work that they were doing in terms of race and race justice, and certainly in terms of equal opportunities, as was called then. I remember a church actually that we funded at the time actually gave funding back because they couldn't get on board the work we asked them to do, which was to draw up an equal opportunities policy, which was pretty saddened at the time. So yes.
I would like to change that slightly, if I may. Outside of the law, I think that individuals make such a difference. Stephen Lawrence had parents who were very, very incensed by this, and they were so strong. They were not going to give up. Yeah. They fought a battle that many of us are afraid to start. And they were strong enough to take it on, and to take on the powers that be. And when you're a Black person and you've got to take that on, it's double the work. But they were prepared for that. Yeah, they had a young son who had so much potential. They were looking forward to a man who was going to have a fantastic career, preparing to go to university. And what did they have? A funeral. And a funeral brought about by such cruel circumstances. And I admire those parents who left no stone unturned. They were going to work at it. And I'm asking today, 30 years on, that's what we need. We need the courage of our people of color who will stand up for what is right. And my thanks goes to that couple. They really worked to get to where we are. And at that time, after the Macpherson report, the Catholic Church brought out something called the guidelines. And whilst I want to give thanks to that and say that was a wonderful piece of work, and I listened to Pat, I think that is only of value if we have people like Stephen's parents who take it on board and make sure that it is put into action.
Excellent. Elizabeth, you were going to say something.
Yeah, from a quite a different perspective. I was actually living and working in the States, in the USA, at the time of Stephen's murder. And because of contacts and family over here, that's how I heard about it. It didn't hit the national press. And so I heard about it, as I said, through friends and family. And at the time, I was the Director of Public Health for Fort Bend County in Houston, in Texas, and was really working around racial justice in a big way in what is called a red state, Texas, and some very extreme racism. And I do also remember getting the paper. We used to get the British papers on a Sunday. And just as Pat said, what I remember was the slant in the media. And the slant being very much about Stephen's family and suggesting that that was the problem, actually. And inferring, let's say, that Stephen was a member of a gang. And there were questions like, what was he doing in that place at that time, which could only persuade public opinion. And I do remember saying, That's just typical, isn't it? That's absolutely typical. And I had heard about the many murders before. And actually, Stephen's murder and the subsequent responses formed part of my decision to come back from the United States and start working really in a hugely activist way in this country. And I just want to add as well to what Yogi was saying about Stephen's parents, Neville and Doreen Lawrence, who worked tirelessly and of course continue to work tirelessly around issues of racial justice. Baroness Lawrence, of course, speaking very strongly in the House of Lords constantly and publicly constantly. But there is an element actually to the response of why Stephen, what was the difference with his murder versus all these other murders that had gone before? And in actual fact, besides his parents, that is not to underestimate or to limit what his parents did, but there was a big element of this, and that was the Daily Mail. And it was Paul Dacre, the editor of the Daily Mail, who in actual fact, the Daily Mail had run the same sort of stories about the family as every other leading newspaper until Stephen's father, Neville, complained about the Daily Mail's coverage. And Paul Dacre realised who this family were and that Neville Lawrence had worked as a plasterer at his house. And he actually said if he had not had a personal connection, and I think that that's the big issue, it's about connections, if he had not had a personal connection with the Lawrence family, they never would have run that headline that said murderous. If you are not, sue us. And that made a huge, huge difference in the whole landscape. It's not singular, but in the part of the landscape that did make a difference.
Excellent. Richard.
I just want to focus a little bit on the police response to Stephen's death. And there was lots of discussion of that response. And the question of, are the police institutionally racist, came up. And it took another 6 years for it to be accepted that institutional racism existed in the police and other places. A lot of us around the table and others we were part of were very aware of this issue of institutional racism because we had been around in the Scarman inquiry where Lord Scarman said there is no institutional racism. He defined it in a way that he could say that honestly. But that question kept bubbling, and it kept bubbling around the response to Stephen's death, and on until finally, thank God, in the McPherson report, we had a definition of institutional racism and acknowledgement that the police were institutionally racist. And for a lot of us who had been thinking about this for a long time, it gave us the option of raising the question of institutional racism far beyond the police, including the church.
The only thing that I would add, and really it's on the back of what Richard was saying, is about the initial police response and the impact of that, because their response was basically this: we're not looking for anybody else beyond this small group of young men who were engaged in this, in their terms, stabbing that seemed to take place, and it must be gang related. There's probably drugs, and certainly from my personal perspective, I remember that was part of, for me, the ongoing notion of, I really hope that it wasn't a black person who did this, because I'm not sure I can cope with yet another front page headline on my way to work. Being a commuter, where do I sit? Where do I look? Whose eyes can I not catch because of the front page. So that was my kind of personal sense. The other thing just around Neville and Doreen that we've not really mentioned, their commitment, but also the cost. There was a phenomenal cost to that family as a consequence of their commitment to take that forward. And the point you make about people of colour being bold enough, I think sometimes we back off not because we don't have the personal courage necessarily, but because we're frightened of what the cost might be if we go forward on this. And I think that had they known what it would cost them in terms of their personal lives and relationships, would they have done it? I don't know, but they did pay the price, and I think that's really something that we need to acknowledge and recognise.